Concept 52.2 says the structure and distribution of terrestrial biomes are controlled by climate and disturbance. And again, if you have had the chance to travel around our country, or if you've been really lucky and been able to travel around the world at all, you've seen that different areas of the world look differently with different plants, different weather conditions. They are what we call biomes, and biomes are major life zones characterized by particular types of vegetation, if we're talking about terrestrial biomes, land biomes, or physical environment, if we're talking about aquatic biomes. We're going to start by looking at some of the land terrestrial biomes, and climate is very important in determining why a biome is the way it is, and why is a desert different from a forest, and why is a forest different from, say, chaparral, and why is chaparral different from the tundra. Well, the main reason is because of climate, and remember, climate affects the latitudinal patterns of terrestrial biomes. So the biomes you'll see near the equator tend to be different from the biomes you're going to see closer to the North and South Pole. So if we divide the entire Earth into different types of biomes, there's probably about a dozen of them. Everything from tropical rainforest to savanna to deserts to tundra to coniferous and broadleaf forests, and you can see how they're distributed kind of around the world. If you look carefully, you'll also notice particular patterns. Like you'll notice that for the most part, tropical forests tend to be near the equator, near the center of the planet, whereas, say, coniferous forest tends to be up toward the northern edges of the planet, and tundra tends to be both north and south, toward the North Pole and the South Pole. So you can see kind of particular patterns as you look around the entire world and divide it into biomes. Now, what we can look at is what's called a climograph, and a climograph shows you temperature and precipitation in a particular area, and temperature and precipitation, rainfall, snowfall, are very, very important for determining what type of plants and animals are going to live there. And it's not just the amount, although the amount is important, it's also the pattern. Does like all that rainfall happen in 2 months of the year and the rest of the year is dry, or is that rainfall evenly spread out throughout the entire year? So it's not just the amount, but also the pattern that has a big effect. So here's a good example of a climograph for North America. If we want to look at, say, just the United States or the United States and Canada, and we could look at deserts and tropical forest and coniferous or broadleaf forests and look at this climograph. So along here we have the precipitation, the annual mean precipitation in centimeters, and the annual mean temperature. And you can see quite a few things. You can see, for example, that a temperate broadleaf forest and a temperate grassland and a desert, they all can have about the same temperature. So it's not just temperature that has a big effect, but look at the annual rainfall. You can see that the forest requires a fairly large amount of rainfall. The grassland generally gets less, and of course the desert gets even less. So not only is it temperature, but it's also the amount of precipitation and when that precipitation comes. You can see, of course, if you look at the most precipitation, you're going to get into tropical forests. The least is the deserts. If you look at temperature, the least is going to be like tundra, and the most is going to be deserts and tropical forests. So this is a cool, what we call a climograph, that shows you how precipitation and temperature interact to give you the different biomes. The land biomes or terrestrial biomes are usually named for their major physical or climatic factors, or for the type of vegetation that lives there. And if you move from one biome to another, it's not like a sharp line. If you start to go from a forest to a grassland to a desert, you're not going to see like a line painted on the ground that says, okay, now you've left the grassland and you're in the desert. It's going to be a gradual change as you move from one part of the world to another. And the areas of intergradation, the areas where it sort of is changing, say from forest to grassland, that would be called an ecotone. And you can see one of these ecotones right near you. Like where I live in Tyler, Texas, it's pretty heavily forest. It's a mixture of broadleaf and pine forest. And as I drive towards Waxahachie, as I drive toward Dallas, toward the west, the trees get thinner and thinner. First I start to lose the pine trees, and for a while I have broadleaf oak trees and the like, and then the trees continue to get thinner, and suddenly nearer to Dallas and Waxahachie it becomes less trees and more grass. And as I continue to move west, if I continue to move out toward say toward west of Waxahachie, west of Fort Worth, it begins to get even drier, and the grasslands eventually, if you go out toward western Texas, start to become scrubland, chaparral, desert type conditions. And that's because of rainfall. Tyler, Texas gets a lot more rain than Waxahachie. Waxahachie gets a lot more rain than some of the desert areas of West Texas. And so you can see these slow, gradual changes. Just as I drive along Interstate 20 from Tyler toward Dallas, I can see that change. Another change you might not think about is if you go up and down, higher and lower. Again, going back to, say, the forests of East Texas here in Tyler, you can look at different biomes or different areas of life from the canopy of the forest. We could look at vertical layering. We can look at the very top of the trees called the canopy, and then we could look at the lower level of the trees. Then we could look at the shrubs, and then we could look at what's called the understory, and then the ground layer, and then the root layer of the forest floor. And you're going to find different creatures and different weather sort of patterns, microclimates in all of these areas, from the very bottom of the forest floor all the way up to the very tip top of the trees. And this gives different creatures different ecosystems. And some of the creatures that live in the very tops of the trees, they may never interact with the creatures that live on the forest floor. They live in entirely different ecosystems, even though they live in the same forest. So these biomes are pretty complex, and they're always sort of changing and adjusting, and the living creatures and the weather conditions, the biotic and abiotic factors are always interacting. It's never static. Biology is always changing, always developing, always evolving, which makes it a cool type of science to study. Now, if you look at that world map where it shows the biomes, you can see that there's deserts in different parts of the world. There are deserts in northern Africa, there's deserts here in North America. So deserts can occur throughout the world, as well as tropical rainforests, grasslands, and the like. Well, because you can have different parts of the world have similar ecosystems, similar environmental conditions, you can get what we call convergent evolution. And remember, we talked about this before. You can find creatures that seem very much alike, even though they're not very much related. So, for example, we have cactus in North America, and there's something called a euphorbia in an African desert that looks very similar. So here we have some cactus in North America and what's called a euphorbia in African deserts, but they're not actually very closely related. If you look at the genetics, they're not as closely related as they look. But this is convergent evolution because they are under the same environmental stressors, they are under the same environmental natural selection pressure. They tend to evolve to have some similarities in the way they look or function or behave. So these are convergent evolutions, and we see that oftentimes. If you look at deserts all around the world, you'll find creatures that have similar adaptations and habits. If you look at grasslands all around the world, the creatures may not be very closely related, but you'll find some similarities between them because of this convergent evolution. The last thing we'll talk about before we take another quick break is disturbances. I said that biology is kind of an ever-changing sort of science, and if you're studying ecosystems and ecology, it's all about change as well. Disturbances such as storms and fires and human activity can also change a community and have an effect on a particular biome. For example, frequent fires can kill off woody plants and trees and maintain the characteristic vegetation of a savanna. So grasslands like the African savanna, the reason that they tend to stay grasslands and don't get eventually taken over by trees and bushes is because there are frequent fires that wipe out those particular plants. And there are even some creatures who have to have the fire. There are types of pine trees who cannot release their seeds until after a fire. So big changes like volcanic eruptions and forest fires, these cause major changes in biospheres, and there are some creatures that actually benefit from this, and then of course there are some creatures that don't benefit from these things. So if there's a forest fire, suddenly that's going to wipe out some of the big trees, and it may leave gaps where the newer trees or the younger trees suddenly have sunlight and they can grow up in their place. So you can see some of these changes caused by disturbances. A good example of this is, for example, in the Great Plains. Like think about Nebraska and Kansas and that part of our country. Well, this used to be massive grasslands covered with deer and buffalo and pronghorn antelope, and there would be grasslands where the grass would be 6 foot tall and it would cover mile after mile after mile of the prairie. Well, we don't really see that much anymore because we have suppressed fires and we have changed the land for agriculture, and so a lot of the grasslands that you would have found as an early explorer of the United States are gone, and you have to travel up to, say, the Dakotas or parts of Nebraska, and you have to look for areas that have been maintained and allowed to stay wild if you want to see what a big part of America used to look like. So that's a good example of disturbances and changes that affect the biosphere and the biomes of the biosphere. We're going to take a quick break, then we'll come back and look at the different terrestrial biomes. So we'll look just very briefly at things like what is a desert and what is a tropical rainforest, and we'll kind of go through all 8 or 9 of them, but we'll only do so briefly. So take a break, we'll come right back.